Look, Dominic, just be honest. You're a commie.
I would respect you more if you were just honest about your agenda and goals. We're not in stage 4 fascism, but to a communist like you, anything right of Marx must feel like fascism?
Well, fair enough.
If you express criticism of capitalism, imperialism, neoliberalism, or the historical and contemporary impacts of race or indigenous people, as well as pretty much any hierarchical relationship within public spaces, you're probably going to be labeled with various titles regardless of their appropriateness. The most common label I receive is communist. So, am I a communist? Well, kind of, but also not really. Is my agenda to indoctrinate others into communism? Also kind of, but not really. To clarify, each political ideology has its own history, influential thinkers, sub-ideologies, and literature to address socio-economic issues. Each of these topics could easily fill an hour-long introduction, but that's not my intention here. I just want to highlight the diversity of political ideologies, emphasizing that they are complex and not black and white, and why using broad pejorative terms shows a lack of understanding. It's important to recognize that the United States has a troubled history with leftist ideologies and has consistently sought to suppress them. From its violent history with the workers' movements during the Industrial Revolution, which was one of the worst records among industrialized nations, to the Red Scares of 1917 and the 1940s and 50s, America has been structured to undermine leftist movements. There has been widespread demonization of ideologies that were once considered pretty mainstream. For instance, in 1912, 1,200 socialists were elected to office, a situation that would be unimaginable today. As a result, the Overton window of acceptable political discourse has shifted significantly to the right, meaning that any discussion of alternative systems in the US starts from a disadvantageous position. I consider myself a leftist when speaking in broad terms, but what does that even really mean? The term originated from the French Revolution, where it referred to a seating arrangement in legislative assemblies. Supporters of the monarchy sat on the right, while opponents sat on the left. However, this historical context is entirely not applicable today. Despite the shortcomings of the political compass, I prefer to use it as a map rather than strictly a test. While it may not be perfect, it provides more clarity than broad terms that fail to define one's beliefs accurately. When I identify as a leftist, I mean that I align with ideals that typically are associated with anti-capitalism or opposition to imperialism and resistance to colonialism. On the two-dimensional graph, the vertical axis represents the difference in level of authority that a state should have, ranging from ultimate authority to the absence of any state at all. If you believe that people are inherently prone to violence or you value law and order, you would likely position yourself towards the top of the spectrum. Conversely, if you think that humans can collaborate and work together through cooperation rather than relying solely on a legislated law, you would fall closer to the bottom of the spectrum. On the horizontal spectrum of economics, we can see a gradient that represents who deserves the surplus generated from production: the owners of a company or the workers whose labor created it. For instance, in the new series, Alien Earth, where 5 corporations own the whole world rather than any nation states, would illustrate a far-right economic ideology. Conversely, if you believe that humanity would be better off through communal ownership without any form of money, well, that would align with the left ideology. I fall over here. Essentially, I'm the love child of Peter Kropotkin and Emma Goldman. But that's my perfect ideal, not what I think that can actually be done today. When someone asks me about my political beliefs, my answer varies depending on who they are and their knowledge of political ideologies. Much like the compass's gradients, my political ideologies also lie on a spectrum. As I stated, I'm a leftist, which means broadly my economic beliefs align with the workers being the beneficiaries of surplus of production. But that's a pretty broad statement, and that's been carried out through history in a multitude of different ways. whether through reform legislation or overnight revolution, and how you would actually carry that out defines what that ideology is. Because I'm a union rep and I have an interest in labor history, I favor the idea of worker-owned and managed production, which is the next broad term I could be identified by: socialist. But there's a multitude of socialists, and it means something different to each ideology. Do we accomplish this through slow planning that generally favors workers over time? Do we tax the wealthy out of existence? Do we make private ownership illegal? Not really my preferred method. Having been in the labor movement for over 16 years, I can speak from firsthand experience when I say that if you try to use a broken system to correct the problem that it caused, you usually end up with a broken solution. We see this all the time with the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. It was the biggest win the workers ever had in this country, but it made them reliant on the proper administration in office, sufficient funding for it to work, which as of recently has pretty much collapsed. It doesn't mean that I don't appreciate the benefits that we've received through it, and I've used the act and different politicians in my professional life. But still, here we are, with huge income disparities and the lowest level of organized workers in 50 years. So if economically I'm a socialist, but I don't favor government intervention, that would be the third, more specific term I'm identified with: Libertarian Socialist. Yes, that's a real term. But even within this ideology, there are still subdivisions and different ways to achieve it. This is where taking the political test can really miss the mark. According to the political compass, I would fall into the anarcho-communist category. But again, that's my ideal, not what I practice at this moment. So let's take a second to identify the word communist, since that's what I often get called. Remember how I said kind of, but not really? There are generally two accepted applications of the term. One is the Communist Party, or what I would call Big C communism, what people generally think of when they hear the word. This is the group that's composed of Marxists, Marxist-Leninists, Maoists, or as some would call them, authoritarian socialists because of their use of the state to bring about change. I'm not going to do a deep dive into that subject because it's not my ideology. However, it is crucial to analyze the successes and the failures of leftist movements. Little c communism is simply the belief in a moneyless, stateless, classless society. And in that sense, yes, I am a communist, but I'm not a Marxist. Up to this point, we've really only talked about authority and economics, but there are many more social issues than who produces goods and services. Libertarianism, not in the American sense of the word, is a rejection of hierarchy and domination, whether by states or individuals. Historically, this was referred to as anarchism. For me, it does no good to replace capitalism and retain the structures and ideologies of colonialism, racism, or patriarchy, all of which can exist outside of economic systems. Instead, I view capitalism as another tool in establishing hierarchy and control over others, which I outright reject in all forms. Obviously, that ideal doesn't appear to be on the horizon anytime soon, so how would I propose the pathway to get there? The fourth of many sub-ideologies I would be identified with would be the Anarcho-Syndicalist movement. Syndicalism is a form of radical unionism focused on workers gaining power through collective and direct action such as strikes. For me, as an organized worker for most of my adult life, reading Anarcho-Syndicalism by Rudolf Rocker felt like a homecoming more than any other leftist ideology I had previously encountered. With the CNT-FAI's victories in Spain and the powerful IWW movement in the United States, I saw that it was a viable and inspirational pathway. If a worker-controlled society were actually achieved, how would it be fairly managed to ensure that the elderly and the disabled are cared for? How would they prevent hostile takeovers from groups seeking to establish authoritarianism? In the production of goods, how do you stop resource extraction and the decimation of the planet? What I would ultimately define myself as is a Libertarian Municipalist, a term that nobody's really ever heard of before, which is why I simply call myself an Anarchist. Libertarian Municipalism was developed by Murray Bookchin and described in his book The Rise of Urbanization and the Decline of Citizenship. There's a lot of room for its application, and as Bookchin points out, without limiting it to a strict ideology, which would defeat its libertarian purpose in the first place. This philosophy is based on a historical analysis of various city-states and on the Greek model of direct democracy. My biggest critique is the Eurocentric ideological viewpoint, since there's a whole lot to learn from indigenous people and other cultures all around the world. Yet this philosophy does leave room for local diversity within communities. Libertarian municipalism is a dual power structure that functions within current society. Its aim is to empower local communities to become self-governing and self-sufficient, helping people to reduce their dependence on existing governing systems and ultimately work towards replacing them. Now, I don't believe that the current power structure will ever willingly cede power, resources, or private ownership over to citizens. Such a shift would only occur through a revolution or a complete collapse of today's systems. Nevertheless, libertarian municipalism offers a valuable way to build within communities and to showcase the benefits of self-management to those who may not yet be radicalized. If or when a full collapse or revolution occurs, communities that have prioritized sustainable food production, open decision-making forums, and the abolition of privately owned resources and the public management of utilities would be better equipped to navigate the crisis. From the remnants of the old system, autonomous townships dedicated to sustainability could emerge, fostering civic discussions and mutual care within the community. In my professional life, I continuously aim to practice the principles of direct democracy and horizontal decision-making, though it is a slow and, if I'm honest with myself, not always successful process. In my leadership role within my organization, I have to continually critique my own mentality and actions, assessing any kind of perceived hierarchy in my relationships with those that I aim to support. There is no room for any patriarchy, racism, classism, or any kind of similar injustice whenever you're trying to create self-empowering environments. The foundation of all organizing begins with one-on-one conversations and building trust and a rapport with each other. So instead of relying on a hierarchical chain of command that issues directives and withholds information, I personally find joy watching people realize that they do have power through cooperation and education. This realization is enough to inspire me to continue, even in the face of a flawed and outdated system. If you want to call that communism, I guess you can. But my agenda is pretty simple: to empower individuality through any kind of collective action and community building with each other.